Is it possible that Freud's atheism and the atheism that Lewis embraced for the first half of his life can all be explained in part on the basis of early negative feelings toward their fathers? A considerable amount of evidence supports this notion. Lewis, like Freud, associated the spiritual worldview with his father, recalling discussions in which the father encouraged him to attend church and become a believer. The question is it possible that our early life experiences, especially our relationships with our fathers, colors our attitude in later life toward this whole concept of an ultimate authority? What do you think from your own observations, from your own personal experience?
I'm curious, why just the father? I mean, why not mother and father, or mother? There's something not entirely intuitive in that.
Freud does mention parental authority, but because the father is often the strongest symbol of that parental authority, he speaks of the father as a heavenly father.
My own father, I juxtapose what you just led us in with my own relationship with my father, where he died a rabid atheist. He wanted to remind me on his deathbed that he didn't believe some of the worldview that I had been embracing. Part of that was to be independent from my father's atheism, but part of that was my own journey. There certainly is a dynamic there that I don't fully understand, but I know it was important to me to carve out my own way, and it actually, I haven't fully resolved why I did that. Part of it was the hound of heaven pulling me, and part of that was probably a adolescent rebellion against my father's strong atheism.
So you're saying that this need to be independent from your father, to rebel against what he embraced, to be your own person, was an influence.
It might be a unique case, because you usually see the other.
That's right.
Doug, is this not also a testable hypothesis? That is, people who believe in God tend to have this kind of relationship with parents, and people that don't believe in God have a different kind of relationship with parents. And I don't think there's any empirical data to support that.
In fact, I think the very important issue that this initial question about the father is that in order to really have a mature spiritual life, you have to move beyond God as the parent in the sky. I think it's almost inevitable that you start out there as a child, because that is your model of an authority or a caregiver or providence. But I think if you're really going to become a thinking person of faith, you have to realize that that's a childish vision of God, the best you can do at a certain point, and then you have to move beyond that to something way different than your daddy.
Yes.
And how do you do that?
I think it's a process.
How do you change your image that's formed as a child, influenced by the parental authority?
I think we have a great deal of information now from other spiritual traditions, particularly Buddhism, Hinduism, the African faiths, things that have allowed us to see God or the sacred or ultimate reality, whatever you want to call that thing, from very different perspectives than just the Judeo-Christian monotheistic Godfather. So I think we have a more multidimensional way to look at the issue that these guys were struggling with, which was very Freudian.
Once Freud defines his worldview, he writes that the doctrine that the universe was created by a being resembling a man, but magnified in every respect, a kind of Superman, reflects the gross ignorance of primitive peoples. His main argument rests on the notion that religious ideas are rooted in deep-seated wishes and are therefore illusions, false beliefs. According to Freud, God does not make us in his image. We make God in our image. Now, do any of these arguments make sense today?
Taking Freud's view, I'm a fan of Freud and a fan of his arguments, but just because you wish that something is so doesn't mean that it isn't so. What Freud's saying is that if you look at the data and you want to take the most parsimonious approach to things, come up with the simplest theory, he'd say, well, maybe instead of saying that a God's there, it makes more sense to say that these are universal human wishes, And the best explanation as to why people around the world come up with different conceptions of God is because there's this universal need for explanations, comfort, order in the face of chaos and disorder.
Would you say then that these are feelings, and both Lewis and Freud are describing, but they don't have anything to do with the reality of God's existence, with this basic question as to whether or not he does exist?
No, I disagree. Feeling can reflect truth. What if the feeling is put there, the need to be in communion with an ultimate being is there by design? Okay? Then that feeling is a reflection of truth. It's more than just a feeling.
How would you tell whether it was or wasn't?
That's the difficulty.
But you see, the other point is that
there's two ways of looking at or interpreting the wish fulfillment argument that Freud emphasizes. You know, I grew up in a home that was religious. My parents sort of survived the Korean War and came to America as a result of the generosity of American missionaries. Grew up in that environment, didn't have any problem or question anything about religion. I thought it was just the way things were. And then in high school, happened to pick up this thin book called Civilization and Its Discontents. And I was horrified. I was shocked. I mean, here in the space of 90 pages, Freud undid my entire reasons for believing.
How old were you then, Fred? 17?
14.
14.
Precocious.
And, you know, and I think, you know, that whole idea that, all right, it's only true because I wish it to be true, to me at the time was terrifying, that this could be the case. But the flip side, which I didn't think about for quite some time, was, well, maybe I wish it to be true because the ultimate authority placed that need or that wish within me. He wanted his creatures to seek him.
In 1922, Jack Lewis took his degree in classics and philosophy from Oxford University. At the time, reason and logic dominated academic thinking.
Lewis describes the new psychology of Freud, which made a tremendous impact upon undergraduates, particularly somebody like Lewis, whose life was so imaginative.
The new psychology was at that time sweeping through us all. We were all influenced. We were all concerned about fantasy or wishful thinking. I formed the resolution of always judging and acting with the greatest good sense.
He was saying that all youth at that time were trying to escape from wish fulfillment dreams. They got that from Freud, and they wanted to, in one way, spit on the images of their youth and go on to they knew not what, but anyway leave that behind because it was juvenile.
Lewis was writing a long poem called Dimer. In it, he portrayed belief in God as a tempting illusion, one that had to be resisted. But he found that in his own life, he wasn't so certain. The question of God's existence would not let him go.
I was, at that time, living like many atheists in a world of contradictions. I maintained that God did not exist. I was also very angry with God for not existing. I was equally angry with him for creating a world. Why should creatures have the burden of existence forced on them without their consent?
More than anything, Lewis wanted to write poetry. And for that, he needed the security of an academic career. He applied for teaching jobs at Oxford, but college after college turned him down.
I was attacked by a series of gloomy thoughts about professional and literary failure. Such a rage against poverty and fear and all the infernal net I seemed to be in that I went out and mowed the lawn and cursed all the gods for half an hour.
Lewis's first ambition, a burning ambition from the age of about 15, was to be a poet, a great poet.
I could not say simply that I desired not my fame, but that of the poem. Nor was the feeling a disinterested love for Daimler simply as a poem. It was a desire that something that I recognized as my own should publicly be found good.
His hopes were finally fulfilled in 1925. Magdalen College made him a fellow. The next year, he found a publisher for his long poem, Daimler. Success at last. But it was not enough.
All the books were beginning to turn against me. Indeed, I must have been as blind as a bat not to have seen long before the ludicrous contradiction between my theory of life and my actual experiences as a reader. The most religious were clearly those on whom I could really feed.
The poetry he really cared about was not Ezra Pound and Gertrude Stein. All these years, the greatest pleasure he ever had was from Christian poetry. Things like Spencer, Milton, all of these great poets. And yet he found out that he was reading them, as he later said, with the point left out. The same thing was happening with his friends. The people he thought he should have liked were the college atheists. But the ones he really liked were Tolkien, a practicing, very devout Catholic. Owen Barfield, who asked all the right questions.
I can only describe it as the great war between Barfield and me. When I set out to correct his heresies, I find that he had decided to correct mine. And then we went at it, hammer and tongs, far into the night. Night after night.
Barfield believed that the imagination plays a very important part in how we know. He rejected the model that science is the only way to truth, to acquiring truth. He felt that the imagination lay behind even the work of science. It gave meaning to propositions. And so he felt that Lewis was missing out in his whole approach to reality on what made knowledge possible.
I was suddenly compelled to read the Hippolytus of Euripides. O God, bring me to the sea's end, to the Hesperides, sisters of evening, who sing alone in their islands where the golden apples grow. And the Lord of oceans guards the way from all who would sail into their night blue harbors. Let me escape to the rim of the world, where the tremendous firmament meets the earth, and Atlas holds the universe in his palms. For there, in the palace of Zeus, wells of ambrosia pour through the chambers, while the sacred earth lavishes life, and time adds his years only to heaven's happiness. I was off once more into the land of longing. My heart at once broken and exalted as it had never been since the old days. I was overwhelmed. I called it joy.
When Lewis talks about joy, he talks about something that he labels the central theme of his whole life. But what he means by joy is not the satisfaction of a desire, but a desire that is more desirable than any satisfaction.
There was no doubt joy was a desire. But a desire is turned not to itself, but to an object. I had been wrong in supposing that I desired for joy itself. All the value lay in that of which joy was the desiring. the naked other, unknown, undefined, desired. I did not yet ask, who is desired?
The very experience of joy that Lewis had was an arrow that led to the target of belief in God. Lewis argued innate, deep desires do not exist unless they correspond to something that can satisfy them. If there is hunger, there is food. If there is sexual desire, there is sex. If there is curiosity, there is knowledge. So if there is the desire for this thing that is beyond this world, there must be something beyond this world.
Lewis was still resisting, but growing tired from the struggle.
The fox had now been dislodged from the wood and was running in the open, bedraggled and weary, the hounds barely a field behind. The odd thing was that before God closed in on me, I was in fact offered what now appears to be a moment of wholly free choice. I was going up Headington Hill on the top of a bus. Without words, and almost without images, a fact about myself was somehow presented to me. I became aware that I was holding something at bay. I felt myself being given a free choice. I could open the door or keep it shut. I chose to open. I felt as if I were a man of snow at long last beginning to melt. Drip, drip. And presently, trickle, trickle. I had always wanted, above all things, not to be interfered with. I had wanted, mad wish, to call my soul my own. I had been far more anxious to avoid suffering than to achieve delight. You must picture me alone in that room at Magdalen, night after night, feeling, whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. Total surrender. The absolute leap in the dark were demanded. I gave in and admitted that God was God. Perhaps that night, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England.
Lewis wrote in a letter about his transformation from a militant atheist to the spiritual worldview that it was very intellectual, very gradual, and not simple. He first noticed that throughout his life, from the time of his childhood, that he periodically experienced a sense of intense longing for someone or something that he really didn't understand. And although he describes this experience as the central story of his life, he eventually came to realize that no human relationship could ever fulfill this longing. He saw this as a signpost pointing with unmistakable clarity to the Creator. Is there anything in your experience that parallels that? Do you think that his arguments are convincing?
No. I don't know. It seems like if there is a God and he's giving signs that, you know, you have all the theistic arguments that are recognizing the signposts and all the atheistic arguments to counter them to provide natural explanations. It seems like it's really closely balanced. It's not obvious. It's like you have to take a leap of faith. And shouldn't that be how it should be? Because if it was provable, if there was this many signposts and this many counter-arguments and it was just obvious, then everybody would believe, or they should.
And
but
what
they
would
don't.
be wrong with that?
Nothing, but it's not the way it is.
Is there any reason why it might not be that way that you can think of?
Unless God wanted you to make an emotional leap and not just reason your way to belief.
I think for someone like me, a scientist, it's important that one, do all the research, gather as much evidence as you can, approach it as a scientific question, evaluate the intellectual arguments. But then, as you said, it takes you all the way up, and what you find yourself standing at is a precipice, extending infinitely down with infinite implications. And whether you cross it or not, that is not an intellectual decision.
I think part of the problem is opposing intellect and emotion.
Yeah, that's
right.
Even now in researchers who study intelligence and different human capacities, the big hot new area is to look at the impact of the
EQ.
Emotional on the intellectual, and to see how much those two processes go together.
Well, now, are you implying that that leap across that chasm is based on emotion?
I think for some people it's a leap. I think for other people, depending, I mean, we all have a temperament. Some of us are more cerebral, some of us are more emotional. So there's going to be different ratios of what we bring to the party. But I think religion is both a matter of what we think and a matter of what we feel.
And what we've experienced, and what happens in community. And there's so, I mean, I think we're going to fall into a real trap if we continue to assume that rationality is here and everything else is below it, and that science and religion are incompatible, and that emotions are a lesser form, and that we become paupers because we can't bring in so much else. We can't bring in so much of history and emotional experience.
You know, as you're talking, I'm thinking about, you know, Pascal wrote this great essay, The Wager, where really what we're all getting at, it strikes me, is we're all betting on something. And we have incomplete information to place that bet, but in light of what we think is the most reasonable bet, we're putting something down on it. And it does strike me that's as much certainty as we're going to get, you know, that everything is a bet, and the bet gets validated over time. You know, the payoff is maybe incremental. But you always have to compare it to other bets you'd make. You know, I mean, Michael, you're betting on one thing, somebody else is betting on another. And
I gotta so disagree with that image, I just have to say. I think we're not betting on anything. I think this is about living. I think this is about having meaning in our lives now, here, in relationship, in the present. It has nothing to do with the payoff at the end, I think.
No, you're getting me wrong. I'm not saying...
But betting that it's right or wrong, it doesn't even matter to bet if it's right or wrong.
We're not talking about the afterlife. I think Pascal's argument is choosing your life, your worldview, and your life path. That is a bet. That is a gamble. You are choosing a path.
You're
gambling your life. If I choose to follow and embrace a worldview, an atheistic worldview, I have put my money down.
I think Pascal said I could either be a believer or a non-believer. If I'm indifferent as between the two, I might as well be a believer, because if I'm not, and it turns out that religion or a religious worldview is correct, I might suffer eternal damnation and, moreover, not benefit from eternal salvation.
But how can you believe something that you don't think is true? I mean, certainly an intelligent person can't embrace something that they don't think is true.
Well, they could be
there's something about us that would object to that.
Right. Well, the answer is they probably do believe it's true.
I think
but how do they get there?
Well,
see, that's why both Freud and Lewis was very interested in that one basic question: is there an intelligence beyond the universe? And how do we answer that question, and how do we arrive at the answer of that question?
Well, in a way, this is an empirical question, right? Either there is or there isn't.
Exactly.
And either we can figure it out or we can't, and therefore you just take the leap of faith or you don't.
Yeah. Now, how can we figure it out?
I think something that was perhaps not as common in their day as is common now, this idea that we're acting as if belief and unbelief were two really radically black and white different things. And I think for most people it's a very fuzzy line. So that
it's always a struggle.
Rather than I think there's some days I believe and some days I don't believe so much, or maybe some days I don't believe at all. It's a process. And I think for me, the big developmental step in my spiritual life was that in some way that I can't understand or explain, that God is right here, right now, all the time, everywhere.
How do you experience that?
I experience it through a glass darkly. I experience it in little bursts. I think my understanding of it is that it's always true. And sometimes I can see it, and sometimes I can't. Or sometimes I remember that it's true, and then everything is in Technicolor. And then most of the time, it's not. And I have to go on faith until the next time I can perhaps see it again. I think of a divine reality, an ultimate reality, would be my definition of God.
Freud called religion an illusion. For over 30 years, he developed this idea in his enormous body of work. His first major book, The Interpretation of Dreams, was published in 1900, a book for the new century.
I completed the dream book. I was once again intoxicated with a hope that a step toward freedom and well-being had been taken.
The book flops. It falls on its head in a way that is unbelievable, because the medical scholars read this and say, it's nothing to do with medicine. The popular reception is virtually zero. Freud is desperate.
Not a leaf stirred to reveal that the interpretation of dreams had any impact on anyone. Understanding was meager. Praise was doled out like alms.
It takes an enormous amount of time to sell the first 100 copies of the book. But based on that book, Freud is now taken seriously in a subgroup in medicine and in culture in Vienna.
A group of followers, Alfred Adler, Carl Jung, Otto Rank, gathered around Freud and his work. The group gave themselves the name the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. Within 20 years, there were dozens like it throughout the world.
The essence of psychoanalysis, of Freud's creation, is interpretation. Reading symbols, understanding stories. It's this interpretive thrust, which I've always felt is so Jewish in Freud. Judaism is an interpretive religion, and psychoanalysis is an intellectual discourse which turns on interpretation.
From his work in The Interpretation of Dreams, Freud began to see that mythology reflected human history and human psychology too. On his desk, there was a collection of statues, heads, busts, figurines, ancient objects that had been dug up.
Freud imagined himself as the archaeologist of the soul. And so one of the things that he does is to think about this notion of the psyche as having levels, as being equivalent to the levels that the archaeologist digs through. But he also understood that those levels represented different civilizations, different stages of development of civilization. Religion is something that Freud sees as something that has to do with the archaic past of human beings. And these objects, these beautiful aesthetic objects, are also ritual objects.
He identifies in the language of religion and mythology terms that can be appropriated for scientific use. He retools pre-Christian Greek stories and sees them as oracles to the inner workings of humankind, and then arranges a scientific approach to understanding that phenomena within the structures of rationality.
Religions owe their compulsive power to reawaken memories of very ancient, forgotten, highly emotional episodes of human history.
I think that Freud decided, because of his analysis of myth, that many of the myths were in common. The myths about paradise, about expulsion from paradise, about immortality, about resurrection or rebirth, could be found in so many different societies and cultures, and in ancient cultures, that it made him think about how similar they were to many of the beliefs in current religions like Judaism and like the different branches of Christianity.
Freud tells the story of being brought to a church and being sort of overwhelmed by the spectacle. He tells this as an adult about a childhood memory. He tells other stories about the nanny also, about the seductive power of the nanny in terms of her belief, her piety. These stories Freud tells to talk about the pitfalls of religion. He doesn't like religious practice, so he says only a child would have been suckered by these candles and this incense.
Later in his life, Freud would bring all his thinking on religion together in the book, The Future of an Illusion.
Religion is the universal obsessional neurosis of humanity. Like the obsessional neurosis of children, it arose out of the Oedipus complex, out of the relation to the father. Our God, reason, will fulfill whichever of our wishes nature outside us allows.
Freud claimed religion is an illusion, but our science is not an illusion. Darwin had shown us that we descend from monkeys, that Copernicus has said we are not the center of the universe, and Freud was saying, come down from your heights, human beings. You are not as great as you think you are. You have to save yourself from your delusions. You are full of sexuality. You are full of hatred and lust and envy. Face yourself. I am going to save you from those delusions.
God was not an illusion to C.S. In 1931, he had converted to belief in God. He was a commanding presence in tutorials and in the lecture halls of Magdalen College. But beneath the outward mask of confidence and professional success, he still struggled with his faith.
I'm appalled to see how much of the change I had thought I had undergone lately was only imaginary. For the first time, I examined myself with a serious, practical purpose. And there I found a zoo of lusts, a bedlam of ambitions.
Lewis still was very much aware of his own flaws, his shortcomings, his short temper, his impatience, with ignorance, his lack of charity toward other human beings. But he was aware that he was called to be differently with them.
Depth under depth of self-love and self-admiration. Pride. It was through pride that the devil became the devil. It is the complete anti-God state of mind. Pride is essentially competitive in a way the other vices are not. Pride is a spiritual cancer. It is my besetting sin. The real work seems still to be done.
When Lewis first converted, he wasn't happy. because the first thing that happened to him was the realization that God was God and that he was not his own God. God was a transcendental interferer, barging into Lewis's life and saying, "You're not God, I am God."
It must be understood that my conversion at that point was only to theism, pure and simple. I knew nothing yet about the incarnation. The God to whom I surrendered was sheerly non-human.
Lewis believed there was a God, but he did not yet have a specific way to worship him. He was attracted to Hinduism and Christianity.
I think Lewis made a conventional objection to Christianity that it's so much like other religions. Dying and rising gods, and redemption from sin, and the triumph of life over death. These seem to be common patterns, so they could be explained psychologically instead of historically. And then one of his friends, who was an atheist, who looked at the life of Christ and said, "Rum thing seems to have really happened once." And that shocked Lewis.
If he, the cynic of cynics, the toughest of toughs, were not, as I would still have put it, safe, where could I turn? Was there then no escape?
He was reading G.K. Chesterton, because Chesterton tells, in effect, the history of the world and how it was leading up to the incarnation.
A great man knows he is not God, and the greater he is, the better he knows it. The Gospels declare that this mysterious maker of the world has visited his world in person. The most that any religious prophet has said was that he was the true servant of such a being. But that the Creator was present in the daily life of the Roman Empire, that is something unlike anything else in nature. It is the one great startling statement that man has made since he spoke his first articulate word. It makes dust and nonsense of comparative religion.
He begins to read the New Testament in Greek. He begins to understand that the New Testament is not just a set of stories, but actually a witness to the presence of a historical human being who embodied the Spirit of God, that this person did not sin. And so this was only possible if this person truly was God in human form. The claims that Christians believe actually came from Jesus are either absolutely true, and this argument stems from Chesterton, either they're absolutely true, or Jesus needs to be confined to the lunatic fringe.
To believe in some sort of a God is fairly comfortable. It's more inconvenient to believe in a God who's so specific and so particular that you can say, there he is in history, there are his words, there are my responsibilities, I can't make it up.
As I drew near to Christianity, I felt a resistance almost as strong as my previous resistance to theism. As strong, but shorter-lived, for I understood it better. At each step, one had less chance to call one's soul one's own.
Lewis simply did not understand where Christ fitted into it until finally that night in 1931, he had invited Tolkien and Hugo Dyson, two of his closest friends, to Magdalen College. It was a windy night. They went along before dinner. They walked along Addison's Walk, talking about mythology. They stayed up to 4 a.m., and Tolkien did his work well.
What Tolkien showed me was this: that if I met the idea of sacrifice in a pagan story, I didn't mind it at all. I was mysteriously moved by it. The reason was that in pagan stories, I was prepared to feel the myth as profound. Now, the story of Christ is simply a true myth.
His imaginative questionings and his imaginative longings came together by focusing upon the Christian Gospels as outlined by Tolkien and Dyson.
He was a literary critic. And as such, he said, I know myth when I see it, I know legend when I see it, and I know an eyewitness account when I see it. I recognize metaphor when it's there. All of this is in the Bible. All of it is inspired. But far from all of it is literal history. Well, Dyson and Tolkien pointed out that the only difference was, we don't know that Osiris walked the earth, but Jesus left footprints. People saw him and talked about it.
As we continued walking, we were interrupted by a rush of wind, which came so suddenly on a still, warm evening and sent so many leaves pattering down that we thought it was raining. We all held our breath, appreciating the ecstasy of such a moment.
I think it would be a mistake to think that argument converted C.S. Lewis, because he thinks that we have to be oblique. We can't look at things directly. They escape us. This is what his attempt at introspection taught him. When you're thinking, and now you start to think about your thinking, you're not thinking about the original object anymore. You know, I'm thinking about baseball. Now I'm thinking about how I'm thinking about baseball. I'm not thinking about baseball anymore, you see. It's very elusive. So Lewis understood that we had to have an oblique approach. As he put it, you have to sneak past the watchful dragons of self-consciousness.
I know very well when, but hardly how, the final step was taken. I went with my brother to have a picnic at Whipsnade Zoo. We started in fog, but by the end of our journey, the sun was shining. When we set out, I did not believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And when we reached the zoo, I did. I had not exactly spent the journey in thought, nor in great emotion. It was more like when a man, after a long sleep, becomes aware that he is now awake. But what of joy? To tell you the truth, the subject has lost nearly all interest for me since I became a Christian. It was valuable only as a pointer to something other and outer.
Lewis's worldview is very much based on a person that appeared in history. He looked at very carefully the historical documents, and this person claimed to be God. And indeed, Lewis concluded that this person was who he claimed to be, and that he died as he predicted he would, and that he rose again on the third day. Now, if this person did appear today so that we could experience him, would we believe?
No, when you could still freely choose not to believe.
Yes, I mean,
you could say that I believe that there is this force. The evidence is demonstrable and clear, but I choose to live otherwise because, for my own reasons, I disagree with some of the claims of that authority.
Did you not say that if you saw someone pick up this building, twirl it around on its finger, and set it down, that you would believe, you'd be forced to believe?
Strong motivating factor.
Do you believe in miracles?
I admit of anything, I need to see evidence.
Well, I'm not asking about evidence. I'm asking about the philosophical question of, is it possible? Is it possible?
I operate by rules of induction. I mean, you know...
well, no, I mean, you have to... You see, you have to...
What went before leads me to believe what will come in the future, but I've never seen that before, and it would be so extraordinary that it would completely...
But you're open to the idea.
I am open to the idea.
That's the point he's trying to get you on.
If you look at the Hebrew Scriptures, though, I mean, it's filled with story after story after story of the Israelites, the chosen people, seeing God in the most miraculous ways, beyond anything that is conceivable in human terms, and certainly beyond anything that they had in their armamentarium of science and intellect to explain.
What you presuppose in your argument is that these incidents actually happened. And show me the parting of the Red Sea. Show me turning water into wine.
Yeah, but I think this is where we have to look at mythology and how mythology is real, or is true but not necessarily real, and that this is a way in which people make sense of the miraculous, make sense of the unknown, make sense of the battle to understand, to be loved, to not be loved. Why does, going back to father or mother, you know, how come, you know, why did mother love you best? You know, I mean, we come up with Cain and Abel. I mean, we do have mythology. It grows out of for a reason. It's not like just stories.
Isn't it true, though, that, as Lewis says, that the philosophy that we bring to our experience, to our observations, influences how we interpret them? Now, if we approach a miracle with a philosophy that has ruled out the supernatural, then we have to find some explanation for it.
If one excludes a priori the possibility of miracles, as most scientists do, then any unusual event will always be interpreted in some way in terms we understand. On the other hand, if one does admit to the possibility of miracles, what one is saying then is that there are forces that can act on the universe, as Lewis puts it, from outside the system being what we normally consider to be obeying the laws of physics and chemistry and so forth.
I grant you that.
Okay, so, and that's when one comes down to, is this story made up or not? And the key thing there is, here is a man, Jesus Christ, who's documented, he's claiming to be the Son of God. Now, I've seen patients do that in my psychiatric rotations. I'm Napoleon, I'm Caesar, I'm God, I'm Jesus even. But they're invariably psychotic. And yet, from the scriptures, from all the witnesses that we have, what Jesus said reflects some of the deepest, most insightful wisdom into human nature. He's not a lunatic, okay? He's not crazy. There's no other alternative other than to assume that this bizarre claim, this fantastic claim that's never been made or spoken by human lips in the history of the world, has to be true. There's no other explanation.
Fred, can I ask you just a simple scientific question? The resurrection.
Yes.
As a scientist, aren't you curious how God did it? Jumpstart the heart, rebuild the cells, new DNA. How do you do it?
Well, I guess that's akin to asking the question, how did he create Adam?
Aren't you curious? Don't you want to know?
Sure, I'd like to know, but in some sense, here's an example. You have a God of infinite wisdom, assuming that you believe in a God, right? So, of infinite wisdom, who created this fantastic thing by means, you know, that you've asked me to explain.
But just, if I can clarify that. Once you've tried to understand the forces by which God intervened into this system from outside the system, you're just back in the system again looking for natural causes. God used some electromagnetic force to tweak the genome, to restart the heart, to whatever.
No.
If that's what you're doing, then you're just doing science.
No.
And the only other choice is you just say, beats me, it's a miracle, I give up.
There are a few other answers to that throughout history. I mean, it's, well, one of the classic theological answers is that God's time is not in any way connected to human time, and that therefore God can break in to human time at any point, at any time, and does, so that God is infant in the manger, and God is reigning on the cross, and God is dead and alive, and God, I mean, because God is not confined by human history, human time, and it's just as reasonable, if we're going to stay with, you know, qualifying things by reason, to assume that God can have God's own time and not be controlled by us, not be the white-bearded father in the sky. Those are all projections that God is defined by, you know, our little limited consciousness.
It sort of disturbs me that we seem to be heading in this direction where in order to be a religious person or to have a spiritual worldview, you have to believe in miracles, which I think is absolutely not the case. Right. I think you can be you can have no interest in miracles. You can disbelieve miracles, or maybe you could say maybe there are miracles, maybe they're not. I don't know. I don't particularly care. You could have any of those attitudes and still be a profoundly spiritual person.
Is it possible that Freud and Lewis represent conflicting parts of ourselves? A part of us that yearns for a relationship with the source of all joy and hope and happiness, as described by Lewis. And another part of us that, like with Freud, raises our fist in defiance and rejects this being. Whatever part we choose to express will, of course, determine our purpose, our identity, and our whole philosophy of life.
What are your views on the question of God? Share perspectives with others in our discussion forums and explore the subject in greater depth with a wide array of artists, scientists, writers, and thinkers at pbs.org.
A presentation of WGBH, Boston.
Funding for this program was provided by Lawrence Rockefeller, the John Templeton Foundation, the Arthur Vining Davis Foundation, the Paul Montrone Foundation, Tom and Gert Phillips, the ServiceMaster Company. Funding is also provided by these funders: this program was also made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station by viewers like you. Thank you.